So we're going to return to this series. I keep thinking of new topics that we can include within this, and I've got some that I've assigned to Don, and hopefully when he's back, he's in South Carolina this morning, but when he's back, he'll be able to share some more messages with you in this series as well. But for those of you who haven't been with us, the point of this is just to hopefully connect the realities of our everyday lives to the gospel of Christ, who Jesus is, what he's done for us, his grace. And so we've gone through a whole bunch of different topics already. But this morning we're going to talk about materialism a little bit. And right away, you probably feel a little uncomfortable. I feel uncomfortable with that topic. You start talking about anything related to our own checkbooks, start to fidget a little bit, right? At least on the inside, if we're good enough to keep it in check on the outside. But here's what I'm hoping is going to happen as we talk about this morning. I hope we can look at this in a balanced way. In my experience, really for over 20 years in the church, going to different churches as just an attender and being on staff at different churches and hearing different types of messages, I've kind of seen two extremes. The one extreme would be the prosperity gospel. Hey, come to Jesus and you're going to be healthy and wealthy and everything's going to go great for you. And included within that is this kind of implicit or explicit promise. You're going to have a lot of stuff. You're going to have, God's going to bless you financially and materially, and you're going to crush it in this world and do great because you're in with the King. That's one message you hear out there in the Christian world, kind of one extreme. The other extreme is this notion that God would have you impoverished, that you should have nothing. You should almost take a vow of poverty. And in that extreme, if the first extreme kind of leads to this lust and greed that's just unhindered or unfettered, the other is the vow of poverty extreme, and that leads to this sort of guilt. And if one feeds the lust, the other kind of hides the lust, but it's still there, but it just is hidden. And what happens in the vow of poverty message and that atmosphere, it becomes kind of this constant need to hide what I do with my stuff, or a need to or the apparent need to judge other people, to monitor other people and what they do with their stuff. And so then that becomes part, there's all this guilt and judgment that goes along with that. So what I'm hoping that we can see this more is more of a balanced perspective, just seeing that we all have a lot to be thankful for. We all are blessed. We live in America. I don't think we have to be embarrassed about that. God has put us here. It's his decision. We have stuff. We can be thankful. And we have problems with our stuff. All of us do. And I would ask you this morning to resist the urge to think about other people and their issues and just let God talk to you this morning about this. Okay? So, for starters, we live in a world of stuff. We just do. Again, in America, we have a lot of stuff. And we have a God. I love this picture. We have a God who's a creator, and he creates this beautiful world that we get to live in. And I like this picture because it contrasts God's creation with man's creation. And both are impressive. I think we would all say that God's is more impressive. But men make some pretty cool stuff too. We have a God who's a creator. He's a designer. He's an engineer. He's an architect. And he created people with similar attributes that reflect his character, people made in his image. And we make stuff too. Everything from skyscrapers, which are always impressive to me, whether you're just looking at them and how huge they are, or walking around in one. You ever walked around up on a 80th floor of a building? There's something, when you stop and think about it, it's magnificent about that, being that high up. I mean, it's an impressive structure. And it was designed and built by men. And that goes down to the smaller level of everything from houses and cars and boats and TVs and electronics and video games and toys and all these things, all this stuff that we have. Because we have a God who put us in a material world, a tangible world, and gave us the ability to create, to take the stuff that he made and to rearrange it and create our own material things, objects. One Big difference. Obviously, God can create something out of nothing. You can't do that, and I can't do that either. But what we can do is we can take what God has given us, we can rearrange it, and we can create something. Because we're made in His image. We reflect our Father. We're a chip off the old block in a way. And so we get to build and create, and we get to enjoy things that are built by men and women. Of course. We live in a world of stuff. James 1:17 says, every good gift comes from above. 1 Timothy 6:17 says, God richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. God's not a Scrooge. He's not cheap. He's not a miser, penny pincher. He's generous. He gives. Gladly gives. We're richly blessed to live in this world and to taste riches, the riches of things. Secondly, living in a world of stuff, we humans tend to worship stuff. We do. We tend to worship stuff. We get our value system out of whack. So in Exodus, God says to His people, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven or above or on the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. What God is saying here is don't fashion things with your hands and then worship them and serve them. This is basically the prohibition of idolatry. And at root, it's not like over the years I've known people. I remember a friend of mine years ago wouldn't allow his kids to have little toy animals or things because he felt like it was a violation of this verse. That's not what this verse is getting at. God is always addressing heart issues, and He's talking about the heart that wants to worship stuff, that attributes more worth to that which is made than to the one who made it. It's idolatry. And He says, when what you worship, you will serve. You will live subservient to. You will be enslaved to what you value. And so God is telling us not to worship stuff. And in a sense, warning us when we do, we will be enslaved by that. Romans 1 reveals that we have all been guilty of this. We have all exchanged the truth of God for a lie, worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. We've all violated that command of God, which is given for our good. We all do it. We worship stuff. And we get ourselves into all kinds of trouble as a result of that. There's a whole spectrum. There are those who are neurotic savers, I would say, and those who are reckless spenders in here. And all of us, every one of us, fits somewhere on that spectrum with how we view and handle our money and our stuff. And God would tell us this morning, when we worship stuff, which to one degree or another we all do, we get ourselves into trouble. And it can take us the direction of reckless spending or neurotic saving or somewhere in between. But it wreaks havoc in our lives. And there's a verse. I'll jump ahead. 1 Timothy 6, 9 and 10. Those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves through with many pangs. Does he say that money itself is evil? He says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's another way of saying it causes all sorts of problems in our lives. It pierces us through with stars as we chase it. So we get ourselves into trouble. I've got these images here. What would be right would be to love and worship and serve God and enjoy with thankfulness what God has made in creation and to love and serve others with that. What we tend to do is love, worship, and serve the stuff, and in our discontentment, we are using others. That's the human tendency, is to be a taker. And it brings trouble into our lives. A few different examples of this. One problem, enough is never enough. You found that to be true in your life? I mean, most of us have lived long enough to realize that's the case. I get a little something, I want a little something more. I get one of those. And I'm going to tell you, I've been very disciplined because I only have about one per week probably at this point. If it was closer to our house, I'd probably have more than one per week. But you have something good, and you taste it, and you think, I want more of that. And it can quickly become more and more and more and more and more. And enough is never quite enough, is it? So that's one of the problems, and we're just chasing, enslaved to that craving. We worry about our stuff. The book of Ecclesiastes depicts the man who has great wealth and yet can't sleep at night because he tosses and turns thinking about his stuff and how he's going to protect it. And some of us have tossed and turned thinking about our stuff because of we don't know how we're going to pay for it. We've got debt or whatever. I mean, it introduces that type of trouble into our lives. We worry about our stuff. As one said years ago, we don't have our stuff has us. We fight over our stuff. We do, don't we? Kids fight over stuff. Adults fight over stuff. For kids, it's usually made of plastic, and it says made in China somewhere on it. For adults, it's a little more sophisticated maybe, but it's still the same basic thing. Augustine, the church fathers, said this: the city of God is a place where the inhabitants love people and walk on gold. The city of man is a place where the inhabitants love gold and walk on people. We want what we want, and it's very easy and very natural for our stuff to become more valuable to us than God and other people, and we would even kill people for our stuff, whether that be actually physically killing them or just in our intent, in our hearts, in our anger, wanting them dead, because something is more valuable than someone. The politically volatile country we're living in right now has everything to do with this. Do you realize that? So different debates that go on regarding different governmental systems, economic systems, capitalism, communism, socialism, all that has to do with what do we do with our stuff. And it's a war between the haves and the have-nots, the 1% and the other 99%. And what happens is everybody that's thinking through, as we always do, play armchair quarterback, and we're always thinking about what other people should do with their stuff. Instead of saying, wait a minute, what is my responsibility? And what is God teaching me with regard to my stuff? We want to sit in an elevated place, sit as judge, and determine what should be done. And I read this quote. I've been reading a book. It's called 10 Books That Screwed Up the World. And one section in there is about Karl Marx and his writings on communism. And in that section, the author says, according to communism, and I think this would be across the board true, history is a relentless driving conflict of classes, which is another way of saying humans are always fighting over stuff. And as we talked about in Sunday school, we had a great discussion this morning. You said, there's no human system that's going to solve this problem. There is no perfect way. I think there are some ways that are better than others, and I certainly don't think communism is a good idea. But from God's perspective, in terms of his kingdom, it has to do with us just looking at ourselves, looking at God, trying to grapple with how we handle our stuff, how we think about our stuff, and being content where God has us. And even the New Testament says, hey, look, are you a business owner? Are you upper class? Then be thankful and be content where you're at. Are you a slave? Then be content where you're at. As Paul said, I've learned the secret of contentment. And then he went on to say, Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. People rip that out of the context all the time and make it, deal with all these other matters of their lives. But really, it's in an economic context, just saying, look, God has you where he has you. And Christ is enough for you. Which again speaks to that issue of just me as an individual, just looking at myself and not feeling like I've got to monitor, scrutinize, dictate for other people. But this is part of our humanity. It's part of our root problem, our depravity. And it's something for us to consider as a threat to our own peace of mind and our own security in God and our own joy in God. And so now, as we proceed here, next thought. We live in a world of stuff. We tend to worship stuff. And Jesus didn't worship stuff. And I don't know if you can tell, but that picture is a picture of the soldiers casting lots for Jesus' garments when he is hanging on the cross, naked and penniless. And if you back up in your mind to the beginning of his life, he came into basically a poor working class family. His father was a carpenter. And Jesus lived with perfect contentment at every point in his life. Jesus had stuff. He understood the desire to have more stuff. He was, as it says in Hebrews, he was tempted in all ways we are tempted, yet without sin. He didn't succumb to that temptation. You remember Matthew 4, when Jesus is beginning his ministry and Satan is enticing him there in the wilderness. And at one point, Satan, it says, takes him up on top of this high mountain and shows him the kingdoms of the world and all their glory and says, if you will worship me, I'll give all of that to you. And in one sense, Jesus felt the tug of that. He sympathizes with our affliction and temptation. So he understands. He would have had to have felt the tug and yet never gave into it. So he lived with things but free from enslavement to things, didn't he? And he gave, he shared. He came not to be served but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And then he dies, as is portrayed there in the picture. He dies with nothing. And we know he could have called a whole army of angels to fight for his kingdom, for his stuff, and he didn't. He just accepts the embarrassment, the humiliation. He accepts even the seizure of his things, which is pretty amazing when you consider how enslaved we can be to our stuff, and yet he just lets it go. I mean, he's truly incredible. And it says in 2 Corinthians 8:9, basically, if he wouldn't have done that, we couldn't be saved. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. He just willingly gives it all away to come and rescue us. I mean, he lived in, you talk about luxury, he lived in heaven with his Father. Everything's perfect there. I mean, really, when Satan brings him up on the mountaintop and shows him the kingdoms of this world, I mean, what are those to him when, in a sense, he holds the whole universe in his hands? But he willingly gave all that up and comes and lives here as a middle class, lower middle class, blue collar worker. And then gives and serves So, now what? Well, Hebrews 13, 15, and 16. I'm going to read this to you, and I want to just kind of tease out a few ideas and let you think about them. At the end of the book of Hebrews, the author, after celebrating the gospel, celebrating what Christ has done for us, this is what he says. Through him, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruit of lips that give thanks to his name, and do not neglect doing good and sharing, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. He's really talking about two results of a relationship with Jesus, an appreciation for Jesus and all that Jesus has done for us. Two outworkings of that. The first one being thankfulness. Thankfulness. So psychologists talk about this idea of mindfulness. It's interesting, as I've been reading recently, they encourage people who tend to struggle with depression or anxiety are often plagued by thoughts in their minds of the future and the past. They're always thinking either in the past or the future. And I've certainly battled this in my life, where you just kind of get caught up in what you think could happen, the bad that could happen, or the good that you want to happen, and how you're going to get that done. And you kind of can be stuck living in the past or the future all the time. And there tends to be a lot of anxiety that goes along with that. And so psychologists are advocating what they call mindfulness, where they would say, hey, look, stop, catch yourself going there to the future or the past, and just try to live in the moment a little bit. Just try to think about where you are right now, what you're experiencing right now. And so one day after I was reading about that concept, Jill and I went out on a Monday, which is kind of like our date day and our day to regroup a little bit. We send our kids off to school, and then we can actually go and spend a little time together. So we were going running errands, and it was one of those really beautiful days. It was probably in the 70s. The sun is shining. We went out for lunch. We went to Dutch Brothers. Take a sip. And we're literally drinking our Dutch Brothers coffee. Sunroof's open. Fresh air. Sunshine. And I'm telling Jill about this mindfulness idea. And how, wow, yeah, that makes sense. And even from a biblical perspective, can lead to thankfulness. And at that moment, as we're having this discussion, this Bruno Mars song comes on the radio, and I thought Jill was going to, like, her mind just, she's like, just amazed. She loves, like, her favorite song or one of them. And so the sensory overload of just taste and sunshine and a great song on the radio, you know what it brought about in our lives in that moment? All too brief, but thankfulness. Thankfulness. It's a gift. It's a gift. Good taste in coffee. Sunshine, even when the sun's not shining, still a gift. A little harder to interpret it that way, but it is. I mean, cars that we have, houses that we have, that God has allowed us to have, that are a gift to us. And what the writer of Hebrews here is saying is that there's something to be thankful for there. God isn't, again, he's not a Scrooge. He's not here to take everything away. I remember when I was a kid, I thought, well, gosh, if I follow God, he's going to send me off to some third world country and I'll have nothing. And I'll live, in poverty and then die as a martyr. And it could happen, but, there's something twisted about the way I got there in my head, though, that misunderstood the character of a gracious and generous God who gives us countless opportunities to just say thank you for what we have. Sometimes we have a lot, sometimes we have a little. Paul says, I learned to be content, whether I had much or little. He saw it as being a gift from God to him. So thankfulness would be one spillover. Another that's mentioned in this passage is sharing. So just sharing what we have with other people. Now again, that's not natural. What's natural is to fight for our stuff. So we reflect on Jesus and his, sharing, we could say it in a magnificent way, sharing. Think of that verse again. You know the grace of the Lord Jesus. Though he was rich, though he had everything, he became poor. He willingly became poor. So that we, through his poverty, might become rich. I don't know what that does for you right now. You're all in different places. Some of you are in places where you're materially and financially pretty secure and stable right now. Others of you are not. Some of you are in tons of debt. Some of you are not. I don't know where you're at. But I'm just hoping that those truths regarding Christ, who he is, what he's done for you, would help liberate you a little bit from whatever's enslaving you, whatever's controlling you. That he would allow you, as Paul talked about, to be content with what you have, where you're at. That he would allow you to see that those who crave and strive after riches just pierce themselves through with many sorrows. In Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, Solomon talks all the time about how people who chase riches, riches just take up wings and fly away. And who hasn't experienced that? Gosh, where'd all our money go? Why are we stuck here? So, things to think about for all of us, and hopefully those thoughts as we kind of go around in our own minds of, okay, where are we at? Do I have my stuff? Does my stuff have me? Am I fighting for it? Am I having that incessant craving that's never satisfied? I mean, where am I at? My hope and prayer is that God would minister to you there. And he would encourage you there with the truth that your guilt is washed away, whatever guilt you feel or whatever, that's gone. Yeah, he'd show up this morning, wouldn't he? The woodpecker? Yeah. So that he would meet us there and just liberate us as we see his value, as we see the value of our God, his great love and mercy and his great generosity, and that would, again, free us from ourselves and that twisted, perverted, upside-down value system that we tend to have by our human nature. So I want you to think about that, and I'm going to close in prayer. Okay? Pray with me. God, thank you for your love for us. Thank you for Jesus and his life and his amazing generosity. And Lord, we do want to be free. I think we would all agree. We don't want to be stuck, enslaved, oppressed by our own greed, our own covetousness. And we can very easily slip into that. We thank you that you're committed to our rescue, our full and final rescue one day in the future when we see Christ face to face and everything else pales in comparison. But in the now, in the here and now, pray that you would liberate us more and more. And I know that you're sovereignly doing things in our lives, allowing some of us to be a little bit comfortable and others of us to be not comfortable at all in terms of our material things. And we're all somewhere on that spectrum, and we know that you're involved either way. And for what we do have, God, that there would be gratitude. There would be thankfulness. There would be an ability to just taste and see that you are good, and that you gave good gifts. And when we are experiencing lack, or what appears to be lack in our lives, that we would see you as enough. And what you have for us as enough. And that we would trust you as a good father to be where you have us. God, thank you for your mission to come for us, to rescue us from ourselves. And pray again this morning that what we've talked about would stick with us, God. That it would haunt us in a good way, in a liberating way. And that we would, as a result, live in peace more and more, and joy and sharing and service for our good and for Christ's glory. In his name we pray.